So this is an example of how one might take your methods that you wrote before the study and change them to past tense and more specificity after the study. This is an example from my dissertation. So this was part of what was in the proposal. In this study, focus groups interviews of teachers separately and administrators across 4 districts will help refine the research questions, etc., etc. And I did state as I went along which districts and how many people. Here you can see what I wrote or revised afterwards. Participant districts were chosen through a purposive sampling procedure guided by literature that suggested accountability pressure drives differential organizational response to science education. So here I'm justifying I'm labeling my sampling, purpose of sampling. And if you want those labels, go back to my lecture on sampling. And then I'm citing the literature to say, hey, look, this is my justification of why I'm sampling this way. 3 districts were selected within Northern California to represent high poverty, wide poverty distribution, and low poverty context. Okay, so notice that I went from saying I was going to do 4 to saying that I did do 3. So that can happen. That's where you need to really write up what you actually did. So to answer a brief question, someone asked how to assign an identifier to a piece of data, like, here's an interview and I want an anonymous identifier. So first of all, there's no specific common practice, but you can either assign one something like initials, so use the first initial of their name or something like that, or you can ask them to enter something in a survey or to tell you something like their birth month and day, and that latter one so it depends a lot on what you're doing and how you collect your data. So just to let you know, there's no common practice, but there are a couple of things that you can do that that people can do to collect data and identify it. So this is the wording in your qualifying exam 2 regarding your conceptual review. So in section 2, it says review of empirical and conceptual literature, and then it has some stuff about the literature review. This is your review of the empirical literature, which you've already done quite a lot of. And then this part in red here, an in-depth review of the concepts, conceptual models, or theoretical approaches that have been used to frame or investigate the problem. So what that means is, you've seen this, hopefully, in the articles you read occasionally, is that they have their review of what's going on in the literature in terms of the actual empirical research, the data that's been gathering, but then they also have often a theoretical framework or a conceptual framework where they say, here's the theories I'm going to use to try to understand what's going on in my data. Or here's the theories I'm going to contribute to. Sometimes they say that if they're really awesome. So we are going to be embarking on a review of a number of theoretical frames or conceptual frames that people use to understand your problem. The purpose of doing a conceptual review is to become familiar with the ways researchers have approached your problem theoretically, and to garner enough understanding of the multiple approaches to be able to select 1 or 2 for your dissertation. So in the end, we're going to be looking at somewhere between 3 and 5 different ways to conceptualize your problem. And then that will allow you to wisely select one way rather than just happen across a way to understand your problem. So for example, teacher change, my area of research, right? So I look at what it is that helps support teachers to change their practice, their instructional practice towards equity-based science education. I could examine that through cognitive learning theory. So I could look at, the latest theories around how people learn through maybe engaging in different problems over time. I could look at that through organizational theory, which would help me to understand how the organizational environment produces certain kinds of responses in teachers, so supports certain kinds of responses. Or I could look at it through critical theory, where I'm really thinking about how um, ideologies that are related to power that are in the general society are translated into the educational context in ways where teacher beliefs might be influenced and they may think their students are not able to engage in certain kinds of teaching. So that's three different theoretical frameworks that I could use to interpret and understand data on teacher change and practice. So here I'm going to give you an example of how to find a theoretical or a conceptual framework in a paper and what purpose it serves so that you can go to your papers and figure out where it is and how to write it up. This paper that I'm drawing from is by Scott Tunison, and it is in the book groups for case studies. So I wanted to use an example article that we already provided for you. And there's also a link under this week's folder in Blackboard. Starting on the third page of this article, this author proposes a conceptual framework, quite easy to find. Then they call it a theoretical framework, which is a little bit weird, and we'll talk about that next week. But nonetheless, they've clearly defined that they're looking at school effectiveness literature and family community school partnership research. So they're drawing from two bodies of theory or ways that we understand things. So this has to do with the way we understand whether or not schools are effective in teaching children, and this has to do with how we understand the way that school community partnerships function. All right. So then this author draws attention to a particular study that proposes a particular model, which is a conceptual framework, essentially. All right. So it's a model of school effectiveness. Now, notice that this is from 1979. So this is one of those sort of seminal pieces that was from a long time ago. And that afterwards, this author says, hey, look, 3 decades later, there's been a much finer point on these findings, right? So we rarely will use as the foundation of our theoretical framework someone from 1979, because there's a lot of work that's been done in the meantime that provides nuances and a more complex or even just a more modern understanding of what's going on in that area. Okay, and then, talks about a number of other folks. So finally, this author starts to define the actual theory and starts to get in and list literally 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here's the different ways in which parental involvement can be delineated and understood. All right. So again, this is really a conceptual framework. It's we'll talk again more about this next week, but just a hint is that conceptual is sort of a mid-level theory. It's not way up here like social capital theory. It's like, look, this is how we think something functions, right? And so so this author then lists the 6 ways that this thing functions. So this is the next page of the conceptual framework, and you can see, we're finishing up here with numbers 1 through 6, framing this process of community involvement in schools. And then this person connects these theories with their own research. So extrapolating from this research, it could be said that schools should foster a climate in which parents feel comfortable, and then, that the nature of that involvement is important. All right. So it's this person sort of like setting out, hey, look, I think that in our study, we're going to find that the nature of that involvement is important. And then they go on to talk a little bit more about the empirical literature. So after that, the author gets into this more of an empirical literature review, so a normal review of the research literature. So they've set out their conceptual framework, and now they need to do the research literature. Now, to show you how the author then uses this theoretical framework, I'm skipping all the way to the end to their reflections, which is kind of like a discussion. Most authors call this a discussion. And you can see here, this author says, I return to the primary research question. To what extent has the formalization of family community school partnerships affected student achievement? Sorry, I'm reading it it's quite small on my screen. So then they're going to get into a summary of the findings and then briefly touch on theory. Now, this author does not touch on how the theory affects their findings or relates to their findings very much. I certainly would hope for a little bit more, but I want to show you how that works. So here in their discussion, they briefly touch base back on this theory. They say, right in here, that trusting the structures that are provided through the educational experience is really important. So they really brings back this idea of trust and mentions that, hey, we found that this framework of Edmondson's, these 6 areas of parent community partnerships with schools, that schools had not yet reached that. So they're using this framework and they're saying, yeah, we tried to figure out if that was happening and it wasn't happening. But these other things were happening. So this author uses this conceptual framework based on this other person's idea and brings it back into the interpretation of their own findings.